Hello, welcome back. This is the 5th lecture on ceramic art history in a series that Northern Clay Center has put together. I'm a teaching artist at Northern Clay Center. My name's Elizabeth, and these lectures are from a class I taught a decade ago, and we're hoping they can be useful to teachers who are now teaching online. The readings for the course originally were from the 10,000 Years of Pottery by Emmanuel Cooper, and also Susan Staubuck's book, Clay. And the page numbers that the students would have read prior to the lecture are listed here. They would read them both for more images and also for context and what might be going on in other cultures at the same time. If you aren't interested in taking this class with the readings, you can just listen to the lectures, or you can start with the next slide. We left off last time on the Italian peninsula with the Greek colonies in the south, and then the Etruscans in the central and northern parts, all of those near the coast. So the city of Rome was established in 753 BCE in the center of the peninsula. At that point, the Etruscans are the dominant culture in that area. By 500 BC, the Romans have freed themselves from Etruscan rule and expelled them from Rome. The Roman Republic was established in the entire Italian peninsula and expanded outward through conquest and diplomacy. The most avid collectors of art were the Romans, who decorated their townhouses and country villas with Greek sculptures according to their interests and taste. The Roman aristocracy cultivated a refined classical environment in their homes. By the 1st century BCE, Rome was the center of Hellenistic art production, and numerous Greek artists came there to work. Interest in Greek art and culture remained strong during the Roman imperial period, and especially so during the reigns of the emperors Augustus and Hadrian. For centuries, Roman artists continued to make works of art in the Hellenistic tradition. The Romans also made redware throughout the empire, plain redware without reliefs. But the finest Roman pottery made during the Augustan period is known as Aretine ware, named for the region in which it was produced, which is now modern Arezzo. The red glossy slip was not only cherished in antiquity by the Etruscans and then earlier the Greeks, but also inspired artists of the Renaissance. Aretine ware shares many of the shapes and decorative elements of contemporary silver and cameo glass vessels. The dancers and musicians on this cup on the left frolic in a field decorated with cymbals, panpipes, and tambourines that are suspended from bows tied to garlands. The production of this, as I said, spread throughout the empire, principally to Gaul, or what is now southern France, and also to Britain and North Africa. The distinctive shape and decoration of the vessel on the left mark it as a product of the Northern African pottery industry based in what is now Tunisia, which exported its wares widely throughout the Mediterranean. The sides of the vessel are decorated with applied motifs produced from molds or stamps. Under the Romans, pottery workshops were well organized, efficient, and effective, introducing technical knowledge to virtually all parts of the empire. To make the relief decorated ware, the Roman potter pressed damp clay into a fired mold, smoothing it against the walls as the mold turned on the wheel. So the mold is in the bottom left there. Prior to bisquing the mold, the potter would have made a relief stamp which is shown top left, and then use those stamps to impress the clay into the bisque mold. Used that stamp to press into the wet clay, and then after the mold was bisqued, the mold would be centered on a wheel, and then the potter would put clay into the mold and press the clay against the walls as they smoothed and turned the interior of the pot. Once it dried, it would shrink in and release from the mold, and then they would add a thrown foot or a thrown lip or both, and sometimes, as in the example in the lower right, handles. I mentioned that this redware was also prized by the Greeks and the Etruscans. All of this ware was coated with the same type of extremely fine particle slip that was used in the Mediterranean era, going back to the Minoans. In Roman times, this fine particle slip came to be known as terra sigillata. The translation of that from the Latin means sealed earth. There's a slippage between the terra sigillata term as used by the Romans and as we use it currently. They meant as in stamped with a seal. For instance, this ware would have been referred to by them as terra sigillata because it has stamps or seals. And we use it now as a term to mean sealed as in watertight. So what was originally a term applied only to the ware with low relief applique has come to be associated with a fine particled clay slip used to achieve a high gloss and make the work watertight. Although some potters were noted for their all black ware, such as the Bucero ware of the Etruscans, which would have been fired in a reducing atmosphere, the most famous of the Roman wares was fired in an oxidizing atmosphere so that it came out a rich red. And remember too that the Greeks had both reduction and oxidation at different times during their firings so that they had both black and red. They used a kiln like the one on the screen that was designed to protect the ware from the flame so that there wouldn't be local reduction turning it black. The Romans built this type of kiln throughout the Roman Empire, both spreading their knowledge of wheel throwing and kiln technology to places as far north as England. Whereas the Etruscans and the Greeks often reduced all or part of their wares, the Romans preferred to fire in an oxidizing atmosphere so that their work came out a rich red. The fine slip created a surface that was popular for tableware throughout the Roman Empire. It was made in Italy often, but also in Switzerland, Gaul, and England. Other wares made throughout the Roman Empire, faience or Egyptian paste continues to be made in Egypt, though with much more ambitious forms. And also lead glazed ware was very popular. These three pieces are Roman vessels with a lead glaze. The technique of lead glazing had been discovered and employed during earlier periods in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Technically, glazed wares were more complicated to prepare and fire as the flame had to be kept well away from the pots. A green lead glaze was popular, achieved with small amounts of copper. When the Roman Empire collapsed, much of its ceramic knowledge was lost, although lead glazing continued to be used in Byzantium and may have formed the basis of later developments in Europe. This is the top of a pottery oil lamp recovered from Roman colonies in Britain. It was found in London specifically. This mold-made lamp belongs to a type known as the volute lamp, from the decorative volutes flanking either side of the hole on the handle. The scene on the discus, the circular decorated area, shows a satyr pounding or grinding something in a large mortar. The clay and other characteristics of the lamp indicate that it was made in Italy and then traded throughout the Roman Empire and landed in London. The trade routes between the Romans and the empires of Asia, there are 4 of them depicted here. This is a map showing the land routes and also the sea routes. By the end of the 1st century BCE, there was a great expansion of international trade involving 5 contiguous powers: the Roman Empire to the far west, the Parthian Empire, the Kushan Empire, the nomadic confederation of the Hun, and the Han Empire, or the Han Dynasty in China. Although travel was arduous and knowledge of geography imperfect, numerous contacts were forged as these empires expanded, spreading ideas, beliefs, and customs among different people, and valuable goods were moved over long distances through trade, exchange, gift-giving, and the payment of tribute. Transport over land was accomplished using rivercraft and pack animals, notably the sturdy Bactrian camel. Travel by sea depended on the prevailing winds of the Indian Ocean, which could only happen when the wind blew from the southwest during the summer months and from the northeast in the fall. In the 2nd century, this land route at the top becomes known as the Silk Road. On the western end of the Silk Road, we have the Han Dynasty, and here's an example of the boundaries. The Great Wall of China was built to keep the Huns out of the southern part of China. You can see the wall on the map as a kind of half zipper pattern running along the boundary between the Hun and the Han. After the civil war that followed the death of Qin Shi Huangdi in 2010 BC, China was reunited under the rule of the Han Dynasty. The boundaries established by the Qin and maintained by the Han have more or less defined the nation of China up to the present day. The Western Han capital, Chang'an, is now in present-day Shaanxi province, was one of the 2 largest cities in the ancient world, Rome being the other. Under Emperor Wudi, China regained control of territories first conquered by Qin Shi Huangdi in southern China and the northern part of Vietnam. New commanderies were established in Korea, and contacts were made with the western regions of Central Asia. The conquest of Fergana and neighboring regions in 101 BCE, which allowed the Han to seize a large number of the heavenly, quote unquote, long-legged horses valued for cavalry maneuvers, also gave China control of the trade routes running north and south of the Taklamakan Desert. In return for its silk and gold, China received wine, spices, woolen fabrics, grapes, pomegranates, sesame, broad beans, and alfalfa. Many of these were packed in clay vessels. Under the Han, China once again enjoyed a period of comparative peace, but the life of ordinary people probably changed very little. In fact, the architecture of the nobles shows us that peasant uprisings were very common during the Han Dynasty. Ruling families had watchtowers such as these models that were found in burial sites. The central watchtower shown on the right is an architectural model made of earthenware with a green lead glaze. And the Han people tended to only put lead glaze on funerary objects. The Han Dynasty established China's lasting model of imperial order and imposed a new national consciousness that survives today among the Chinese, who still refer to themselves as the Han people. The most important manifestation of Han imperial order was architecture. Vast palatial complexes, towered gateways, and city walls were built as symbols of power and prestige, as well as for defense. This glazed ceramic model of a watchtower shows all the essential features of Han architecture. The basic unit is an enclosure defined by 4 corner piers with a widely overhanging tile roof supported by a system of cantilevered brackets. In addition, the house has a second roof over the first story, which is elevated on a stepped platform. An exterior staircase, elaborate latticework screens shield the 3rd story, and a circular central window at the top floor. A great variety of architectural models were placed in Han tombs for use in the afterlife. The higher the status of the person buried in the tomb, the more numerous and elaborate the models. Glazed models were prized over unglazed, which is on the left. You can see that there's some pigment still on the left one, but it deteriorated over time. This is a model of a pigsty that comes from a Han Dynasty burial site. The Han gentry lived in relative luxury and hoped to live equally well in the afterlife. So these commissioned clay models of their mansions, granaries, mills, and in this case even a pigsty, are meant to accompany them into the afterlife. Housing a sow, suckling pigs, boar, roosting chickens, and a dog, the pen is connected to 2 latrines. Tiles line the top of the walls and cover the roofs of the latrines. These combination of pigsty / latrines, similar to this replica, can be seen in many parts of rural China today. This Han era female dancer is 21 inches tall, which is quite large for funerary figures. She would have been once part of a larger group. This elegant dancer is extraordinarily compelling in her ability to convey energy in a perfectly motionless form. The sculptor chose the moment in the performance when one sleeve is thrown back as the dancer gently stoops and flexes her knees, lifting one heel off from the floor. The statue, of course, is motionless, but for a split second before she advances on her toes, her pendant arm remains supremely still. The desire for an afterlife through which worldly pleasures and activities are maintained is reflected in the placing of models known as spirit goods or mingyi, of attendants, entertainers, pets, domestic animals, and a host of worldly goods in Chinese tombs. The furnishings of the tomb reflected the wealth, status, and interest of the deceased, while equipping tombs with such items was understood as an act of homage by the deceased family and descendants. Although certain spirit goods were made of bronze, jade, and other materials, clay was most commonly used. Many types of dancing figures have been retrieved from Han tombs, but examples of this large size with sculpted naturalistic details are relatively rare. The performance of ritual dance during the Han Dynasty was a court prerogative, and the number of dancers permitted to each noble was regulated according to his rank and merit. This thin, elegant dancer is dressed in the traditional shen yi garment, long and layered robes with oversized sleeves. She captures the stately motion and austere spirit of the sleeve-tossing dance style, which featured a continuous, controlled, and coordinated movement of the long sleeves. This piece is also an example of one that was painted with pigments after it was fired. So what we see now is the deterioration of what would have been, we figured out, very bright paint. The three-tiered pottery lamp before you was originally placed in an Eastern Han Dynasty tomb where it was deemed necessary for the soul's safe journey into the next life. The complex structure probably replicates even more elaborate bronze lamps used by Han Dynasty aristocrats in their homes and palaces. By this time, the Chinese had already developed a taste for decorative lanterns and special lighting effects. Most lamps of this period used floating wicks fueled by vegetable oil or paraffin. Grain was stored in these covered jars called hu. Both of these are earthenware with painted decoration applied after the work was fired. Found in tombs, these vessels contained food. During the Han Dynasty, food became both abundant and varied. Even the common people enjoyed great improvements in their standard of living. Han tombs nearly always included storage jars, or hu, full of cereals and wine for the afterlife. This large lidded jar, painted in red, white, and purple pigments with spiral patterns on the right, can be seen as a less expensive substitute for the similarly decorated lacquer containers that inspired its decor. On the left, the hu is decorated with animated drama, a blue beast with bared fangs lunging at a mounted archer. Roaming the other side of the hu is a long, striding tiger. Executed with brilliant pigments and confident black brush strokes, the decoration on this vessel perfectly expresses the boldly assertive character of the Han Dynasty and is moreover one of the finest known examples of Han painting. The iconography of the decor is celestial. The blue beast represents the star Sirius, known in China as the heavenly wolf. And the archer is a personification of the adjoining constellation, Bo, whose arrow always points directly at the wolf star. Their companion on the other side is the white tiger, cosmological symbol of the West, whose domain in the night sky borders that of wolf and bow. Some hu used in burial sites were lead glazed. Lead glazes had been used in Mesopotamia since the 6th century, leading to speculation that knowledge of these glazes was brought to China by traders following the Silk Road. The dark brown lead glaze was made with the help of iron. This large storage vessel is a classic Han Dynasty shape. It is derived from a bronze form and even imitates the molded mash ring handles found on bronze prototypes. The brown glaze is one of the new lead glaze colors introduced during the Han Dynasty. It, as well as green and yellow, became popular in low-fired earthenware such as this. The kiln on the left is one that we looked at when we looked at the Shang Dynasty, and they had developed a simple updraft kiln at that point, which would have worked to fire the lead glazed earthenware. And just to go back a little bit, remember that in the Neolithic times, the Chinese had developed what we now call a tunnel kiln, or a cave or a bank kiln. The kiln was made by tunneling through a hill, and the ware was heated by wood fire built below. And this Neolithic painted pot is an example of one that would have been fired in a cave or bank kiln. During the Han Dynasty, they combine both of these types of kiln into one that is a downdraft kiln. So there's the arch and the rounded form of the tunnel, or the hill, coupled with the fire at the opening. And then the innovation at this point was to shape the kiln so that the flame was directed down across the arch and then drawn up the flue. This is what we call a downdraft kiln. This is important development because the Han Dynasty had porcelain, but was not able to fire it to higher temperatures. And the invention of the downdraft kiln made it possible for the Chinese to eventually fire porcelain. So the piece on the left is porcelain, the piece on the right is stoneware. And during this time, we have what they called an accidental wood ash glaze, meaning that the ash from the fire at the opening of the kiln travels through the kiln with the fire, depositing ash on the work. And when the kiln can get hot enough, the ash will melt, giving it this glaze. We call it accidental because now people intentionally fire work in this way, whereas before it was a byproduct of their fuel source, the wood. You can see that it turns into a really beautiful kind of honey green amber on stoneware. And then on porcelain is a little bit paler, but still greenish. The last type of pottery from the Han Dynasty we'll look at is called Ware, and this is from the later parts of the dynasty, once they're firing to temperatures of 2200. In addition to their kiln innovations, the Han potters were also innovators with glaze. They took feldspathic rocks and ground them up to make glazes. By the end of the Han Dynasty, potters in southern China were making Ware, a high-fire glazed feldspathic stoneware whose greenish glazes come close to the famous green celadon glaze of the later Song Dynasty. The light green comes from small bits of iron in the ground rock that turn green in reduction. That concludes lecture 5. Next time we'll be looking at the Mayan ceramics and another dynasty from China. If you want to read ahead for that one, the page numbers are listed here. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.